All right, good morning, all. This is your Sunday school warning. If you don't want to learn, get out now. This room is for learning. If you already know everything you need to know, get out while the going's good. So, welcome to week 3 of our Sunday school class. Should have been week 4, but last week, Father David was going to teach about the impeachment, and I said, there is no way I am talking about the impeachment in Sunday school. So if you want to do that, you can do it again next week. And as I was thinking about what news to cover, I had a really hard time finding anything that was not related to the winter storm. And then I also kind of realized, too, if we can't make sense of this storm here at church, what hope do we have of making sense of it anywhere? It's something that's worth debriefing and talking about all together and really reflecting on how do we make sense of everything that just happened this past week. Me and my trusty iPad with no internet slapped this together. So let's talk a little bit about the winter storm, and I'll talk for a little bit and hopefully get through this quick enough that I can hear a bit from y'all too. On the next slide, whenever there's someone behind the computer, we'll get there. There we go. So kind of the question that I was asking myself, and the question that I bet some of y'all were asking yourself, and I think that we all should be asking, is where did you see God this past week? Where did God show up this past week? And some of the things that I want to talk about is the good news of a snow day. Where do we see God in intense weather events? That really tricky question, where is God when people are suffering? And then I wanted to talk about the Good Samaritans and some of those really great uplifting stories we heard about people helping each other. So, next slide, a quick warning about the news in general. I'm sorry these slides are small and kind of wordy, but there's no handout, so this is the worst of both a handout and a PowerPoint slide mushed together. So a quick warning, right? In a crisis, we tend to gravitate towards dramatic, sensational stories and kind of the easiest narratives, the things that sound really good, that make the most sense, that sort of line up well. And typically this is because we want to explain why something is happening. Why have I been without power for 48 hours? And we also, especially when we're angry or frustrated or hurt or scared, we want to find a way to channel our emotions. We want to be able to channel those emotions towards something or someone. Why am I feeling this way? Who can I be mad at? What can I be mad about? And so what that means is in kind of the flurry of news stories and immediate things that pop up and rise up, we'll gravitate towards those things that answer those questions in a way that feels satisfying in the moment, but not always in a way that is particularly true, or particularly Christian, or particularly healthy as human beings. So beware of untrue or fabricated stories, right? I remember on Monday there was a picture circulating of a helicopter defrosting a wind turbine, right? And on Monday, when the power was first going out, that, certainly gave a way for me to vent my anger and frustration, to say, well, of course, all the wind turbines froze. And that was what the immediate headlines were about. And then by Wednesday, the headlines were no longer about that. And even the governor kind of walked back some of his earlier statements and said the electricity problem is bigger than frozen wind turbines. We rushed to kind of find the easy answer, but it wasn't necessarily the true answer. And that picture that I'd seen was from like 2014. It wasn't even a recent picture from the current event. It was an old picture that somebody had dug up. Beware of people rushing to use this crisis as a political prop, especially in the midst of it. So beware of the folks who say, this is a clear, and right, I've heard it from completely different angles, which is so fascinating. So depending on what you thought ahead of time, this crisis is either clear, definitive proof that, green renewable energy is a bad deal that is weakening and ruining our infrastructure, or that we need more green and renewable energy because the existing modes of energy production failed us in this crisis, right? The completely completely opposite takes. And also beware that the truth is probably really complicated, and it will take some really careful and nuanced thinking to understand the crisis. And especially when we're in a crisis and in the immediate aftermath of a crisis, that isn't at all how we want to think. When you're freezing, or when, you're a millennial who hasn't had internet for a week, the last thing I want to do is be reasonable. I want to be angry and frustrated and figure out, why is this happening? What is going on? So with some of those caveats in mind, let's talk about snow days. And I grew up in New York. I love snow days. I think snow days are super biblical. They're these wonderful events that rarely do, especially kids, get to experience here in Texas. So I wanted to talk about why I think snow days are so great. And there's this awesome word that J.R.R. Tolkien coined called a eucatastrophe. And a catastrophe is when something really sudden and bad happens. And a eucatastrophe is when something really sudden and good happens. It's a sudden, unexpected turn of events that creates a favorable resolution. It's a good disruption. So Tolkien talks about this in the stories that he wrote about how, the eagles would show up at the end of The Lord of the Rings and save the day. And nobody could have counted on it or expected it or anticipated it, but this sudden good event happens. And Tolkien really talks about how the great eucatastrophe of human history is Jesus Christ, this sudden, unexpected turn for good. And I think there's a little bit of an element to that in a good snow day. Right? A snow day is a disruption. In some ways, it is a catastrophe. But man, when you're a kid in school, that disruption of having school canceled the next day is the best feeling. There's no better meteorologist than a high school student where I grew up. You check I know every website, even down here, I have my 3 different ones. You're tracking projected snowfall averages. Everyone had their own superstitions, the spoon under the pillow, or you wear your pajamas inside out. This is how I grew up. The snow day was a big deal. And digging deeper into that, why is it a big deal? Why is it a big deal to have this sudden event that's completely out of our control, something we can't really perfectly predict, come in and disrupt our plans, disrupt what we thought was going to happen, and how is that a good thing? So, kind of 2 connected ideas that we hear a lot about in Scripture are Sabbath, and this idea of rest and the importance of rest. And then also these ideas of freedom and liberation. And often in Scripture, those ideas are connected together. The idea that freedom and liberation are a part of our Sabbath rest. And when we find a way to rest, there's a sense of freedom that we experience there. So a few biblical examples. One of them is the Jubilee year in Leviticus. So this is, in the long list of law codes, in this description of how the Hebrew people should every set number of years have a Jubilee year, where all debts were forgiven, people were freed. It was the idea that there was almost like a big Sabbath. So you'd have a Sabbath every 7 days. And the Jubilee year you would have every 7 years, or every 70 times 7 years, or really historians don't think there actually ever was a practiced Jubilee year. But it was something that they aspired to, something that lived in their law code that described who God's people wanted to be. They wanted to be a people that said, every set period of time we will have this Jubilee where debts will be forgiven, where people will be allowed to rest. And forgiving debts is also in part releasing slaves. Many slaves in this culture were wage slaves, debt slaves. So the idea that rest was also part of liberation. These ideas come together. I mentioned already that Jesus Christ is this sort of eucatastrophe, that his incarnation and his resurrection are these completely unpredictable, incredible events that out of our control, nothing to do with us, where God has broken in and brought to us peace and brought to us liberation from sin and the life and ministry and death and resurrection of Jesus. I think about the Red Sea narrative in Exodus, and this is why there's so many good movies about the Exodus story and the Moses story, right? It's all the dramatic plagues and Moses, the reluctant hero, and he finally leads his people out, and you think that, they're going to escape, and then the climax of every good Exodus movie is the Israelites stuck. Pharaoh's army is coming, and they're looking at the sea, and they say, this is it. What are we going to do? There's nothing that we can do to get ourselves out of this. And of course, the sea parts, and the Israelites get through, and it's that eucatastrophe, that good turn, that sudden, unexpected event that for the Israelites in that moment brought freedom and liberation. And one of the last examples from Scripture I pulled out was Jesus sleeping through the storm in Matthew's Gospel. I love this story for a lot of reasons. It's a very human Jesus who's just trying to get a little nap in. He's all annoyed that the disciples woke him up, and I can sympathize with waking up from a nap kind of grumpy. It's about as Christ-like as I can ever manage to make myself, it seems. And here you have this coinciding idea that even for Jesus, rest was something important, finding an opportunity to get and claim rest when you could take it. It's also connected to this weather event, too, that God has the power and the authority over these storms, and that the weather for Jesus becomes the only chance he gets to rest. It's not like they gave him a sabbatical. It's, from kind of in the car from one destination to the other is the only time he can catch a wink of shut-eye. So that's kind of what I think about. Those are ways that I see God at work in a good snow day. These deep biblical themes of rest and liberation and that sudden freedom can come out when we have this unexpected event that cancels things that we're doing. I know it's very rare to get a snow day here in Texas, but I would, I'd say this probably also applies to other weather events that happen more commonly here. I had plenty of snow days growing up, but I had my first rain day here in Texas. My very first Sunday working with a new church when I was in seminary, and we just moved down here, we got flooded into our neighborhood, and I couldn't make it. So I had no idea how to call the priest and say, I think I'm rained in. I can't get out. My car can't make it out of the subdivision. So on the next slide, let's talk about, I've already heard a little bit of this morning. Does God use the weather to tell us something? Right? And perhaps you've heard this, you've made this joke. God just wanted us to make sure we started our Lent off really miserably. Had just decided we hadn't sacrificed enough. And all kind of the fun jokes that we tell too, but I know you all have also heard some other people say some really horrible things about God and weather. That maybe not with this snowstorm, but maybe with other hurricanes or tornadoes or natural disasters, that this is in some way God punishing somebody for something. So let's talk about the Bible, and then we'll talk about that. So does God use the weather to tell us something? In Scripture, yes. Just this morning, we're reading about the aftermath of the Noah story, when God floods the world. In Exodus, again, we hear about plagues, which include hailstorms and weather events, the parting of the Red Sea, that God appears in these pillars of cloud and flame, that it rains manna from heaven. That sounds like another really good excuse to have like a snow day. It's like bread falling from the sky. Sorry, I can't get to work. I'm eating my way out of my driveway. In Jonah, there's this great storm that rises up when Jonah tries to escape from God's call to him. In the book of Job, there's a windstorm at the very beginning of the book that kills Job's family, that tears the house down, the roof lands on his kids. Very tragic. And it's that same winds at the end of the book of Job that God speaks out of. That God speaks to Job out of a whirlwind. In the Psalms, we'll read from Psalm 29 and 148 in just a little bit, but many, many, many of the Psalms talk about God's power and authority over the weather in the natural world. Think about in the Gospels, especially Matthew's Gospel, there's that earthquake that happens at the crucifixion. The sky darkens, the earth shakes, the sense that creation has a visceral reaction to the death of Christ. Now, when Christ dies, something in creation echoes and resonates with that. And in the Acts of the Apostles, there's a hurricane, or they call it a northeaster in our English translations, which I think is hilarious. because that makes me think of Massachusetts more than, the Mediterranean. But a northeaster, a hurricane comes up and shipwrecks Paul. It becomes this opportunity for him to share the gospel. So clearly in the Bible, God uses the weather to do things. And then on the next slide, let's see if my words fit. Kind of, not quite. Here's the rub. In Scripture, when God is using the weather, God is very clear about why. God tells people, this is what this weather event means. This is what I'm doing with it. So in Scripture, we don't need to ask what God means or find someone to blame. God has explained what is happening with the weather event. And this is so important. We do not get to decide what a weather event means. We don't get to decide that. If God tells us what it means, that's one thing. I can get along with God's account of it. But we are not playing 20 questions as to why this hurricane or this winter storm or this earthquake, why this has come about. Outside of a direct revelation from God, we don't know. We do not know why a weather event has happened. This is particularly important. We cannot say that a storm is a punishment for a particular sin. In general, the Episcopal Church tends to shy away from doing that. But there are other Christian traditions and other really big, well-known pastors right down the road in San Antonio who've made a great business out of telling people which sins are being punished by which storms. But, as the scriptures say, it rains on both the righteous and the unrighteous. And when we try to play the blame game and say this storm is happening for this reason, that works all well and good until we have a winter storm in our backyard. That's the exact lesson of the book of Job. That we can't assign these simplistic explanations as to why, a bad weather event, a tsunami overseas, is clearly God's judgment against those people. Well, it doesn't feel very good when a hurricane comes and devastates your local communities. So not only should we not do that, we should resist that. So if you hear people saying that about this storm or about other storms, you have my priestly permission to push back a little bit, to say, really? Where did God say that? One thing that I can tell you is that bad weather reminds us that we are small and God is great. And what I love about that truth is that it's equal parts comforting and terrifying at the same time. In the same way that a good rainstorm is equal parts terrifying and comforting. We need the rain to water our crops, to nurture our environment, to build up our wells and water reserves. But, a big thunderstorm can get a little scary too. And so in that moment, a really big rainstorm becomes a reminder to us of the ways that God both comforts us, but it's also a lot bigger than us in a way that can sometimes be a little scary because we don't often like to think about how small we can be or how insecure our lives can actually be. And a few quotes from the Psalms just that I like. Praise the Lord from the earth, lightning and hail, snow and clouds, stormy winds that do his bidding. The great events of God and weather are really just a testament to God's glory and a cause that we should give praise to God for that. And then Psalm 29, which is always in the top 3 of my favorite Psalms at any given moment. The voice of the Lord, which we hear in weather events and the shaking of the trees and earthquakes and rain. The voice of the Lord displays God's glory. So the glory of God is made apparent to us by the way that God speaks in the weather. Any questions about that one? Awesome. The next slide, man, this is going to be a good one. Why does God let bad things happen? If y'all have never asked that question, kudos to you and your invincible ironclad faith. But certainly you've at least heard other people express this idea, and perhaps even from an antagonistic way. How could I ever believe in a God who is good if so much bad stuff happens? And, I think Theologians need to find really good fancy words for things. Maybe it has to do with copyright, or just so we can have conversations and make ourselves seem a little smarter. But the word for this is theodicy, the problem of evil. That how do we have a good God who is powerful and loving, but there's still also evil in the world, or bad things that happen? Why do these bad things happen if God really loves us? And of the many, many things I love about the Christian tradition, this one sits real close to the center. And the way God answers that question is not with a really robust argument. God does not rationally explain the logic by which we have a good, loving God and still have bad things happen to people. And God knows better. And God knows that the only real answer that we need when we ask that question, the only real answer that we're looking for, is a person. So Jesus Christ himself is the answer to that question. And flipping back to the book of Job again, this is what happens. The book of Job is really excellent and wonderful and challenging, also really confusing. But the premise is that Job is this upright, pious guy who lives his entire life in accordance with the law. And Satan, the accuser, literally that's what Hashatan means in Hebrew, the accuser, goes to God and says, well, no wonder he keeps the law. His life is so good. If you made his life miserable, he wouldn't worship you anymore. God, being God, says, well, I'll take that bit. And takes away all of the blessings that Job has. His family, his wealth, his riches, everything. Most of the book is Job in discourse with God and with his friends. And his friends say, Job, clearly you must have sinned. You must have done something wrong that made God punish you. And Job says, no, I've kept the law. I've done everything right. I have not sinned. There's no cause for this punishment. God, what is going on? You owe me an answer. And this is the repeated refrain from Job and his friends. His friends saying, Job, you must have done something. It must be really bad if you're not going to tell us what it is. And Job saying, I haven't sinned. God, you owe me an answer. And so at the very end of the book of Job, God finally shows up. It's like Forrest Gump. And God speaks to Job out of the whirlwind, and God doesn't give Job an answer. He doesn't explain, well, there was a bet, and I was totally going to win. God shows up and doesn't really mince words with Job. But what's so important is that God does show up. God showing up is the answer to Job's question. God, where are you in suffering? And in God's answer, God says, I'm there. I'm in the suffering. I'm with you in the suffering. One of my favorite books of all time is by C.S. Lewis. It's called Till We Have Faces. And it's a retelling of an ancient Greek myth, but really kind of this meditation on the book of Job and that real central question. What does that presence of God mean when we are suffering? This is why the passion of Christ matters. And while we can certainly I think some people get a little, put too much emphasis on the suffering of Christ in the passion and the gruesome, torturous nature of it. We don't necessarily want to do that, but we recognize that in Jesus, God truly knows what it means to suffer. That we don't have a God who is above and beyond us, who has no sense or comprehension of what it is to suffer. And especially in the ancient world, that was a really big difference between the Jewish and Christian faith and the different pagan religions around them. Is that the gods of antiquity were, immortal, beyond suffering. They didn't know what it was like to be human. If you know any Greek myths, often the tension and the drama at the center of the Greek myth is exactly the fact that the gods don't understand what it is to be human. They don't understand what it is to die or to know pain. But in our tradition, God does know those things. That God is with us in that pain. So the presence of God with us is itself the answer to the question. And I acknowledge, too, it's not always a satisfying answer. It doesn't try to make a good deal of sense. It doesn't try to give an account for the logic behind suffering. And that is so often, so quickly why we want to take the tact of Job's friends and say, suffering, clearly someone has done something wrong. Clearly God is trying to teach us some sort of lesson. There has to be an account that we can give of it. But over and over again in our tradition, we're at our best when we realize that we don't have an account to give, at least right now. And God might have one for us someday. But more importantly, what we need more than a rational argument about why there is suffering, we need the presence of God with us, a God who knows what it is to suffer, to know that God is there with us and God is there rooting with us in suffering. So, and presence really matters to people who are suffering, much more than an answer. So I'll give you 2 examples of that. One of them won't be that contentious. And that's the first one, which is when Father David or I come to visit you in the hospital. Because, David is almost a doctor, but not always the kind of doctor you want when you're in the hospital. But when we come there, it's not because we have a medical diagnosis. It's not because we have magic hands that are going to heal all maladies. It's not because we can actually meaningfully do anything to make you better. But we show up in the hospital to remind you that God is present with you and that we're present with you. That you're not alone in your suffering and in everything that you have going on. And so often, that's really what it's all about. It's just the presence. It's a really good lesson that they teach us in seminary is that y'all will never remember any word that we say when we come to visit you in the hospital, but you'll remember when we show up. You also remember when we don't show up. And that's not only exclusively true for priests, let me tell you, because you have friends and family members too who remember when you show up, also when you don't show up. And that's the charge to us, is not to be so wrapped up in our words or arguments or explanations or all the things that we think will make you feel better. But to remember that the greatest gift that God gives us in suffering is God's presence. And the greatest gift often that we can give other people is our presence. And so I'm not making any personal statement on this, but to give you a different angle on a very hot news story right now, is a lot of people are really mad at Ted Cruz. Maybe you've heard this. So, and outside of the whole political landscape, right, I think is this question, that we expect our leaders to be present with us. And that the challenge and the hurt that some people felt was this idea that, our leader doesn't know our suffering, isn't present with us, isn't showing up. And that's a really different way to look at it than the usual red versus blue screaming matches that y'all can go home and read on Facebook. But a deeper and more thoughtful and more biblical way for us to wonder about how presence really matters, how God's presence matters, and how our presence matters in the lives of people around us. Any questions about that? That's a really big thing to tackle, especially as like a part 3 of a 4-part Sunday school class. So I hope nobody feels like it was a perfectly satisfactory answer to the problem of evil, because I don't have that. But it's a great way to think about it. And I do really commend that C.S. Lewis book to you as well. All right. So, and the last thing I wanted to talk about are the Good Samaritans. These are all the kind of feel-good stories that we've seen this past week of people helping each other. So here are a couple inspiring headlines from the past week. Again, one of them will be contentious. I love this story I heard out of Leander, that H-E-B lost power while a bunch of people were shopping there, and they just told everyone, take what you got and leave. Don't pay for the groceries, don't worry about it, we can't check you out, just take your groceries and go. I heard that was, I did hear a story that happened locally, but the big headline that I've seen it's made national news at this point, I think was in Leander? Okay. I'm still getting my Texas geography down. But I did hear about something like that happening locally. And what was so interesting about that story is that so all these people were blown away by the generosity of H-E-B. And I'm still blown away by the generosity of H-E-B. Y'all have a great grocery store. But the people, when they got out into the parking lot, started helping each other. So, the woman who couldn't get her car stuck out of the snow, a bunch of people came and pushed her. People who needed a hand carrying their groceries. So it's this incredible reminder that good acts pay themselves forward. That when we are helped by someone, it tends to make us want to help others. I love this other story. I think this was Houston area. A Texas couple got a delivery on Monday morning, and the delivery truck driver got stuck in the snow, and she couldn't leave. It was on Monday when the snow was really bad. And so the couple said, well, come in and stay with us. And they invited her in. She stayed there for 5 days, sharing their heat and their food, and it was just this couple and their delivery driver. But what an incredible story of hospitality, of generosity, of a reminder of our human family, that a complete and total stranger can be welcomed into your home for 5 days. That's a long time. You're sharing meals and sharing a shower, and you don't know who this person is or if you're going to like them, if they're going to drive each other crazy, but it was remarkable. All right, here's the hair-raising one. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is a representative from New York, raised I put $3 million yesterday, it's now over $4 million for emergency relief for the state of Texas. She's a representative from New York. And if you haven't heard, she has had very, very public skirmishes with a lot of Texas politicians. She does not like them, they do not like her. And that to me is so fascinating, that this sense that to many of our elected officials and probably to many of the people here too, she is kind of this poster child for everything wrong with the left, the Green New Deal, progressive politics. She can rub a lot of people the wrong way. So someone that so many people here in the state, and certainly our elected representatives, see as an enemy, put all that aside to raise money to help people as emergency relief for folks here. I'll get into the biblical story for that in a moment. And some local news that I just noticed from Facebook and people around, that local businesses right here in Bernie were opening up for water and power and heat and hot showers. Hot showers are something, man, I take that for granted, day in and day out. And even just neighbors who got together to fix plumbing problems, and well companies and plumbers right here in Bernie who were doing everything they could to, as quickly as possible, get their community back up and running again. All these incredible acts of generosity and selflessness. So on the next slide, I think we're there, yeah. So the importance of community, right? This is something that became really clear to me, how important community is. We're all in this together. We are interconnected. Nothing makes that clearer than the rolling blackouts that some of us experience. This idea literally that we're all connected together on the same electrical grid. And when there's not enough electricity to go around, we share the sacrifice. And we go without power for a little bit so that somebody else can have power. And that when this worked well, in the communities that it worked well, and it didn't work well everywhere, it's this sense that by all of us sacrificing a little bit, acknowledging our common life together, we could all keep our houses warm enough. We could all have a little bit of heat, a little bit of water. And so our common life together was a little bit of a sacrifice, but persisted and went on. And it didn't become this stark contrast where, the winners and the losers, and some people had power and heat all week, and some people had nothing all week, and still have nothing. And so I've heard this a little bit. I've been tempted to think this a little bit, that clearly the lesson I should learn from this winter storm is that I need to stockpile ramen, that I need a personal generator, that I need to get off of a water utility company and get my own well, that I need to hoard all of these things so that the next time this happens, this historic once-in-a-century blizzard, the next time this happens, I'll be able to take care of myself. And there's such a temptation that would be the lesson that we learn. That the next time this happens, I have to make sure I can take care of myself. But I think that's the wrong response to the crisis. The wrong response is to double down on individualism and self-sufficiency, this idea that we have got it all together, that we can perfectly take care of ourselves. rather than leaning instead on the community. Leaning instead on that magic recipe that when we help others, they will pay it forward. So what lesson could we learn thinking about our common life together? How could we learn to be better neighbors or more caring neighbors or find ways to live together well, to share the burden of our challenges and then also share in the joys and the blessings of our common life together when it goes well? And that idea of community support is deeply biblical. And y'all are probably familiar with the Good Samaritan parable. We like telling it a lot. And often we miss a little bit of the social context. That, we think the Good Samaritan parable is about somebody helping someone else and how good it is to help those in need. But it's a little more complicated because the person who is wounded and hurt on the side of the road is passed by their people, their Jewish people. Priests and leaders, their own, are the folks who walk by them and say, I can't help, there's nothing I can do, it's not safe for me here. And when the Samaritan shows up, the Samaritan is, the hated enemy of the Jewish people. They're just close enough, they're just similar enough, that they're just a little bit different, and that little bit of difference is enough to make the two groups fight. Right? When people are really different, they tend to get along well because there's not much going on. When people are super similar, but just a little bit different, that's when the fighting happens, right? So the Samaritans, these hated enemies, the Samaritan is the one who shows up and helps. And that was a biblical story that I thought about when I saw that headline about AOC. That, the bitter, hated political enemy of Texas is the one who showed up to raise money to help. And then also in the early church, the author of Acts writes, all who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all, as any had need. And it's this really radical vision of what the earliest church communities looked like. I don't think it's a call to us that we need to structure our society exactly on these few verses here. But it is a reminder of kind of the ideal vision that God has for human life, in that it's common life. It doesn't mean that we all have our own wells and our own solar panels and our own grids and that we're all self-sufficient islands who can take care of ourselves. It's that we live in community with each other, which means we do the messing work of figuring out how to love people who are really different from us. And we lean on each other when we need to. That our different strengths and talents, our different resources, our different skills come together to make our common life stronger. That's the vision that God has for our human community. And it's one that I'm wondering a lot about now. What does that look like for us here in Bernie? What does it look like for us as St. Helena's? What does it look like for us as Texas? And certainly for the United States right now as we try and figure out how to love people who are really different from us. All right. So those are some of the ways that I have seen God in the past week. The headlines of the past week and everything that's happened from this winter storm. And with a couple minutes left right now, I wonder if you all have any questions about what I've said, or if there are ways that you've seen God in this past week in the storm.
We had actually a pretty good time. We had no power, no electricity, no water for like 3 days, 4 days. And we got a lot of sleep. I mean, when it gets dark, you eat and you eat food in the fireplace, and what are you going to do? You go to bed. And you did nothing else to do. So it was really kind of associating yourself with pioneer days, and everything slowed down. And it was really fairly pleasant, except it got a little cold.
Yeah, that was, so for the folks at home, Rusty was sharing this sense of which I felt too, this return to the pioneer days where you woke up with the sun and went to sleep when it got dark, and that the pace of life slowed down a little bit. Just a little unplugged, and it's a lot easier to count your blessings when the pace of life is a little bit slower.
To me, I noticed the view of God's creation. It was just beautiful for days and days. And it was amazing. And it was powerful.
have made it no secret, I absolutely adore the snow. I love the snow. I love cold weather. Maybe not like 44 degrees inside cold weather, but the snow is just so gorgeous. And it was a real blessing to be able to see that. It reminded me too of kind of the complicated feelings I have about this. On the one hand, I was really excited to see snow, and on the other hand, my heart breaks for the people who are still without power, for the folks who have suffered enormous challenges and hardships because of the winter weather. And kind of balancing that, rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. How do we hold these complicated feelings together?
So the local HEB here in town, I've heard, is giving away Valentine's flowers for any of you that were able to take it to the store. So there is a local store at HEB.
I did hear that one too. Our local HEB gave away roses and Valentine's flowers just to anyone who came in and shopped over the last couple of days while they had them. Just as kind of an extra gift and a thank you, and just a way to cheer people up who were coming in and just trying to get water and essentials. Well, I'm glad y'all have figured out your complicated feelings about the winter storm. One last thing that I'll just say, there's a little bit of trauma that happens with a weather event like this, right? This was a catastrophe in some ways. It doesn't feel like it, and I've fielded far too many phone calls from friends back home to say, is your state really shut down over 4 inches of snow? But you all know that we're not prepared or equipped for weather like this. And when we go through something that's a little traumatic or a little bit of a crisis situation, just be gentle with yourselves and with others. Some people feel totally burnt out. Some people feel like they don't have any energy. Some people, are go in the opposite direction, or are just ready to do and get back to normal. And they just want to get over this and move on. So maybe if you find some quiet time today, and it'd be worth finding some quiet time today, figure out where you are at. And just be gentle with the people around you, your family and coworkers and neighbors, as we're all kind of sifting through this and figuring out how to get back to normal. It's not like we aren't already living through a historic pandemic crisis either. I don't know how many you can keep layering on top of each other. Well, thank you all for joining me here. I hope you learned something good. Hope you got some good pictures of the snow at the very least. Certainly made my quarantine beard feel vindicated when it was freezing off. And next week, who knows what will happen in the news between now and then? Because frankly, I have no idea. It's absolutely insane. If you really want to hear about the impeachment, you can email Father David. If you really don't want to hear about the impeachment, you can also email Father David. If you want to sign up for our Lenten pilgrimage walking, though, you should email me. And I encourage you all to do that and to jump on our teams. And it'll be a lot of fun and something really different than what we've done. And if you haven't heard about that yet, you'll hear more about it soon. So God bless you all. Have a great day. Stay warm.